What's going on, guys? It's your boy Coder once again back with answering some of your ruling questions. In the last video, I asked you guys to leave ruling questions in the comment section so that I could go over those and answer them for you and let you guys know what the correct answer is to a lot of these ruling questions that you might have. I went through and I picked out a bunch of them that I think are very meta relevant, some with new upcoming cards and some with cards that are very prevalent in the meta that I think you guys are going to want to know the rulings of. So without further ado, let's get into the rulings. But if you guys want your ruling question answered, make sure you leave those in the comment section of this video so I can go over those in the rulings of the next video. So let's get into it. So this next person asked two questions, and I think both their questions are very good because they're very relevant to the upcoming meta. The first question they ask is, Mimighoul Fork says, target a face-down monster your opponent controls, and he chooses to either flip it face up or send it to the graveyard, and you draw 2 cards. What happens if you're under Droll and Lockbird when using this card? So Mimighoul Fork's activation effect basically allows you to select a face-down monster your opponent controls, and they must choose to either flip it face up in order to trigger its flip effect if it's a Mimighoul monster, or send it to the graveyard and allow you, the person activating Fork, to draw 2 cards. While Droll and Lockbird is applying, neither player is able to add cards from deck to hand, including drawing them. So in this situation, basically what the opponent is presented with is 2 options, one of which is illegal because they cannot make you draw cards via the Mimighoul Fork because of the Droll and Lockbird. So basically the precedent set for this card is set by Lullaby of Obedience, a card that lets you declare the name of a monster in your opponent's deck, and if they have that monster, the opponent can choose to either put it in your hand or summon it directly to your field. Under Droll and Lockbird, when you activate Lullaby of Obedience, your opponent is forced to select summoning it to your field because they cannot select to add it to your hand. So that is the precedent for the Mimighoul Fork ruling here, which basically works kind of the same way, in the sense that your opponent is not allowed to select the effect that sends it to the grave to draw 2. They are forced to select the effect to flip the monster face up, and then at which point Mimighoul Fork will resolve, go to the graveyard, and then the monster will activate its flip effect because it'll most likely be a Mimighoul monster. The next ruling that they ask pertains to the Tenpai Dragon cards, a deck very prevalent in the metagame of today. They ask, I declare an attack with Chandra and use its effect at the start of the damage step in order to special summon a Fadra, use its effect to then special summon a Pedra, and use its effect to set a card from my deck. Does all of this occur before damage calculation and can't be interacted with by the opponent, or in which part of the damage step would this happen? Can Fadra or Pedra be interrupted in this case? Alright, let me see if I can explain this as best as I can. So this ruling is actually interesting because I'm going to answer it and then give an alternate scenario that is very similar and could very likely happen in the Tenpai deck that basically shows that the answer to this is yes and no, and you'll understand why. So in the proposed scenario, they declare an attack with Chandra and then at the start of the damage step use the effect to summon a Fadra, at which point the Fadra gets to trigger its effect that says when it's normal or special summon, you get to bring back a Tenpai Dragon monster from your graveyard to your field, and that effect will be allowed to activate and will still activate during start of the damage step, because anytime a subsequent chain is started because a trigger effect was met, that effect will continue to happen in the same substep of the damage step. So because Chandra's effect activated and resolved in the start of the damage step, summoning out the Fadra then meets its trigger at that point, so still in start of the damage step, the Fadra will be allowed to activate its effect to bring back the Pedra from the graveyard, at which point the Pedra will meet its activation requirement for its trigger effect that will allow it to search out or set a Sangen spell or trap card from the deck, and all of this will activate and resolve on 3 separate chains still during the start of the damage step substep of the damage step. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that this occurs specifically because the Fadra and the Pedra have an activation requirement that specifically says when it is summoned. Versus if the chain here was a little bit different, let's say that you had a Fadra on the field, you declare an attack with your Fadra, and you use the effect of the Fadra in the start of the damage step to summon back your Chandra. At this point, the Chandra doesn't have an effect that activates when it is summoned, it only has an effect that can be activated during specifically at the start of the damage step. Now, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. Anytime you have trigger effects that specify that they must be activated during a specific sub-step of the damage step, so a specific event in the damage step, such as at the start of the damage step, before damage calculation, or something like that, they can only be activated during the very first chain that is created in that sub-step of the damage step. So in this case, because the Chandra's effect specifically can only be activated at the start of the damage step, as opposed to Pydra, which says at the start of the damage step or when this card is summoned, because Chandra only says at the start of the damage step, you wouldn't be able to use the effect of the Chandra in order to special summon out a Tenpai dragon from your deck after you have revived it with Fadra during the start of the damage step with the effect of the Fadra. I'll give you guys one little additional example using some different cards to kind of outline what I mean by this. Let's say that you and your opponent both control a Mekk-Knight Crusadia Avramax. Mekk-Knight Crusadia Avramax specifically has an effect that says, during damage calculation, you can make this card gain attack equal to the attack of the special summon monster that it is battling. At this point, those Mekk-Knight Crusadia Avramaxes battle each other. I, as the turn player, would be the one to have to activate the effect of my Mekk-Knight Crusadia Avramax, at which point my opponent would be allowed to chain theirs. In this situation, the chain would resolve backwards. Their Avramax would gain the attack of my Avramax, and then my Avramax would gain the additional attack that was already gained by their Avramax, making it so my Avramax will win the battle each time. However, a lot of people were initially asking if you were allowed to, let's say, your opponent activates the effect of their Avramax, and then you let that resolve, and then in a new chain want to use your own Avramax, and this is where this ruling that I just explained with the Tenpai Dragons comes into play a lot. You are only allowed to activate Mekk-Knight Crusadia Avramax as the first chain in during damage calculation, that substep of the damage step, which is why every time two Mekk-Knight Crusadia Avramaxes battle each other, the turn player's Avramax will always win, because the opponent does not have the option to let your Avramax resolve and then choose to use their Avramax in a separate chain afterwards in order to gain the full attack of your Avramax. So this next ruling is coming to us from Zachary, and they ask, why is stand-up Centur-Ion immune to destruction when all Centur-Ion monsters on the field are in the spell and trap zone as face-up continuous traps? So stand-up Centur-Ion has an effect that specifically says that it cannot be destroyed by card effects while you control a Centur-Ion monster card, and that is the word that is very important. It doesn't say a Centur-Ion monster, it specifically lists a Centur-Ion monster card, and that is why that is important. Anytime a card is treated as a different type of card, let's say you have a monster that's in the spell trap zone as a continuous trap or a continuous spell, it's going to essentially be a continuous spell or a continuous trap or an equipped spell. However, those cards still remain monster cards. Because stand-up Centur-Ion specifically lists Centur-Ion monster cards, it does not check what type of card that the card you have on the field is being treated as currently. It looks at what the original kind of card that card is. Anytime you will summon a trap monster to the field and it specifically says this card is still treated as a trap or not treated as a trap, it still remains to be a trap card. The same thing with Centur-Ion monsters in the spell trap zone, they are still monster cards. Crystal Beasts also monster cards in the spell and trap zone. So that's something to keep in mind. Just make sure to see if cards specify that they want monsters, spells, traps, or monster cards, spell cards, or trap cards. This next question comes to us from Bones, and they say, my opponent controls Tearlament's Kaleido-Heart, which has the effect to special summon itself if it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect. In this scenario, I pop Kaleido-Heart with the effect of Vanquish Soul Caesar Valius. My opponent then activates the Kaleido-Heart effect to summon itself. If I chain DD Crow targeting the Kaleido-Heart, how does this chain and similar effect scenarios resolve, considering Kaleido-Heart does not specify that it has to be summoned from the graveyard? So in the situation of Tearlament's Kaleido-Heart, it specifically says if this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can special summon this card. Now this is the thing that is important to note here. When cards change location, when they go from the field to the graveyard, or from the graveyard to banished, or even from the monster zone to the spell and trap zone, they are treated as being different cards than the initial card that was used. So in this situation, when the Kaleido-Heart activates its effect in the graveyard in order to special summon this card, when you chain your DD Crow and banish the Kaleido-Heart, moving it from the graveyard to the banishment, in this situation, that Kaleido-Heart that is in the banishment is not treated as being this card. It is no longer treated as being the same card that activated its effect in the graveyard. So in this situation, that effect is still going to attempt to summon the Kaleido-Heart, this card, from the graveyard. However, this card no longer exists because the Kaleido-Heart that is now in the banishment is treated as a different card. So that is the same kind of thing that you need to know with, for example, we'll go back to Centur-Ion cards. If I have a Centur-Ion Trudea in my back row, my opponent activates MST and targets it, and I chain the effect of my Trudea, moving it from the spell trap zone to the monster zone, it is treated as being a different card. So because it is treated as being a different card, the Mystical Space Typhoon will lose its target and won't destroy my Trudea. So that's what basically you need to know. Anytime a card changes location, and specifically changes full location, moving from one player's field to the opponent's player's field is not a change in location. It is still on the field. But if a card goes from field to grave, grave to banish, banish to hand, stuff like that, they are changing location, and with each location change, they are treated as a different card. All right, this next ruling question gets asked a lot, so we're going to talk about it. Comes to us from Loker, and they ask, ruling question, player A activates triple tactics talent, player B chains IP Masquerena. It resolves, the IP Masquerena links into a monster that has an on-summon effect, such as SP Little Knight, and then with the triple tactics talent, player A takes the monster that was just link summoned. Question, who is able to activate the on-summon effect of that link monster? So the reason why this question gets asked a lot is because the answer is actually not as clear-cut as you might think. Specifically pertaining to the TCG, there is no definitive answer as to which player is allowed to activate this. This is one of those ask your head judge moments. However, I will answer this question as best as I can using all the information that I have available to me. So in the OCG, the way that this would be ruled is whichever player controls the SP Little Knight. When the SP Little Knight would be able to actually declare its effect to activate is the player that can activate the effect. So subsequently, this is also how it's applied in Master Duel. So a lot of you guys are going to be watching this looking for Master Duel rulings as well. So in Master Duel, that is how that effect is going to be applied. Personally, I would think that it should be universal. The ruling should be applied the same way across the board, OCG, TCG, Master Duel. However, that's not always the case. In the TCG, there is no definitive answer to this one, so you are going to have to ask your head judge. If you are playing something like Talents or something like that, or even if you're playing IP Masquerena, you probably would like to know how it's ruled for a specific event to not make a big mistake and know that it's going to be ruled a certain way or another way, you know, if you're going to be playing those cards in an event. However, on Master Duel and in the OCG, if your Triple Tactics talent takes your opponent's SP that was summoned in Chainlink 2 by the IP, you will be the one that's able to activate the effect of that SP Little Knight rather than your opponent. This also applies to a bunch of other types of cards. Basically, all you need to know is whoever controls the card, regardless of where it met its trigger, whoever controls the card at the moment when you would be able to declare the effect to activate the effect of the card is the person that is able to activate that effect, apply the effect, and resolve the effect. And for this last ruling question, it comes from Ido's Arts and Crafts, and they ask, Rise to Full Height is a card whose graveyard effect ruling I would like explained because many people don't understand how it works, especially if the monster is removed from the field. So Rise to Full Height has a grave effect that specifically says, you can banish this card from your graveyard, then target one monster you control. Your opponent's monsters cannot attack for the rest of this turn except to attack that monster. So basically what this does is it makes it so one of your monsters is going to be taking all of the aggro. However, there is a very interesting interaction that occurs with the grave effect of Rise to Full Height, and this is what we're going to talk about here. So the Rise to Full Height grave effect basically applies aggro onto one of the monsters that you control. It makes it so your opponents can only attack that monster and nothing else. This includes direct attacks, meaning that if you apply Rise to Full Height onto a monster that you control, and then that monster leaves the field for whatever reason, your opponent can't attack anything, not even you directly or any of the other monsters you control, because the ruling on Rise to Full Height specifically says that they can only attack the monster that you control. However, even if it leaves the field, that effect is still applied. One thing to note, Rise to Full Height doesn't affect the monster that it targets. Basically, if you can target a monster that's unaffected by card effects, and Rise to Full Height will still apply. However, Rise to Full Height does affect your opponent's monsters in this situation. So if you have a monster that is unaffected by all card effects and your opponent activates Rise to Full Height, your monster that is unaffected by all card effects can still choose to attack any monster on your opponent's field or attack them directly. It's unaffected by that effect of Rise to Full Height, so that is a way to play around the Rise to Full Height. One other thing that's important to talk about with Rise to Full Height is that, interestingly enough, if the monster is face up on the field and you Rise to Full Height onto it, and that monster is flipped face down later on in the turn, that Rise to Full Height effect will still apply and will still apply to that monster even though it's face down. Therefore, you still can only attack that monster, but you are allowed to attack it even while it is face down. So Rise to Full Height, a pretty finicky card, pretty janky, but hey, has some pretty neat application. And honestly, knowing this ruling and also knowing how to play around it could be the difference between winning and losing in a paleo matchup. With that being said, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this iteration of ruling questions. Leave your rulings in the comments. I had to skim through a lot. I appreciated all the nice comments that you guys left, saying that you guys are happy that the ruling series is back. I'm happy that it's back too. I appreciate that a lot. Make sure you comment, like, and subscribe and all that good stuff. But thank you guys so much for watching. Leave your rulings in the comments section for me, and I'll go over those for the rulings of the next video. But with that being said, thank you guys so much. You guys are freaking awesome. I appreciate you all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one, guys. Peace! Is set by Lullaby of Obedience, a card that lets you declare a name of an Celestial. I'm too fucking Celestial pilled. Bet.